Man has been selling you all $200 Bibles, $500 bottles of cologne, and $50 boxes of cereal to your face. And behind your back, he has been working to make sure that you cannot afford food and rent come January 2025. Big Daddy Trump is really out here giving it to his supporters raw dog, no Vaseline or nothing. Remember, immediately after he got elected, I found out that when he campaigned, he went into small rural communities and mobilized those citizens. He managed to mobilize 70% of rural community citizens to go out to the polls and vote for him. And now you guys are going to be the most negatively impacted by his policies. I also found out you guys are the biggest recipients of Medicaid welfare. And lots of you are using it for treatment of opioid addiction. Medicaid rehab funds that you guys are using more of than any other demographic? Not anymore. Mima, Pawpaw won't be able to afford their life-sustaining medication. And in response to the decrease in Medicaid funds, your local hospitals will be closing down. That's what's projected to happen because they rely on those Medicaid funds that Trump will be taking away from your community. In an emergency, you and your children will have to drive 2 hours to a hospital to receive care in an emergency, in an urgent situation. Your local hospital will not be able to survive those Medicaid cuts. Like during his 2016 to 2020 term, the rural communities and agricultural communities will suffer the most because of his plan for tariffs and his plan for mass deportation. States such as Kentucky, where they voted 100% of the citizens voted against an education voucher system. Guess what? Trump said y'all getting that voucher system any damn way. He's literally sending you all to hell in a handbasket. And he's sending your physical, mental, and financial health right along with you. This is exactly what being prejudiced gets you, you know? You won't have access to affordable health care. Your hospitals are going to close down. So when me, mom, Paw, and your children have a medical emergency, you're going to have to drive 2 hours for an urgent care or a critical care center. You won't be able to afford food, shelter, clothing, any of those things. But you know what? At least there's not a black woman in office. And at least the members of the LGBTQIA community won't have equal rights, you know? At least there's that. I know y'all don't want to hear nothing a black woman has to say, you know? And I know that my supporters like receipts. So I'm going to provide some receipts right now. I'm going to show you a clip of a white man on CNN telling you the same thing that I just told you. But he's going to use some very educated verbiage. So when you're finished watching the clip that I'm going to add at the end of this video, you're probably going to need to rewind all the way back to the beginning and watch me tell you the same thing again in lay terms. But to be concise, because I want to help y'all really understand this, so I'm going to put it down. I'm going to condense it down into one very concise sentence. Y'all are fucked.
Support in rural America seems to have no, meaningful ceiling. I mean, he approached 70% of the vote in the most rural counties, 60% of the vote in small metros, even more than he won in 2016. But when you look at the specifics of his policy agenda, there is a lot in there that put rural communities at risk. In the first term, the biggest losers from Trump's tariffs were agricultural interests. He ultimately had to spend more than $60 billion in public money to try to basically buy peace in rural communities after foreign nations retaliated against American agricultural products in response to Trump's tariffs. He's now proposing even bigger tariffs. Mass deportation, the estimates from the Peterson Institute for International Economics is that would reduce the workforce in ag communities more than in any other industry. Medicaid is especially important in rural communities to rural hospitals. Fewer people in rural areas have private health insurance, and thus they are more at risk from the cuts that Trump and Republicans have been talking about in Medicaid. By the way, in particular, treatment for the opioid epidemic is especially reliant on Medicaid in rural areas. And that is something Trump has pledged to prioritize. And finally, if Trump has repeatedly said, most recently when he announced his appointment for his nominee for education secretary, he wants to pursue a universal voucher system. We have seen in state after state rural voters oppose school voucher plans, for example, in Kentucky and Nebraska this year, because they recognize that rural schools have even less margin for error if they lose people than urban schools. By the way, since I wrote that, Jessica, today, The Washington Post reported on a fifth major policy area that could disproportionately hurt rural communities, which is the idea of privatizing the postal service. It is the provider, the deliverer of last resort in a lot of remote places in the U.S., and a privatization plan would probably have a disproportionate impact on the economies of rural. So you add it all up, there are a lot of places where the interests of rural communities may collide with their ideological sympathy or convergence with Trump.
Yeah, it is really fascinating. And I keep going back to the school thing because for so many people in rural areas, the school is really the center of the community. I think about like Friday night football games. It's where people watch everyone's kids grow up and then their kids go there. I mean, that's really important to the soul of these towns and these areas.
You know, in Kentucky this year, the ballot initiative on school vouchers lost in every county, including the most red rural counties that voted overwhelmingly for Trump, precisely for the reasons that you cite. I mean, I talked to the person who ran that campaign, and she said, you know, every community understands what an anchor really for their kind of stability of their communities the local school provides. The same thing with rural hospitals. 190 rural hospitals have closed in the past 2 decades, and cuts in Medicaid anywhere along the lines of what Republicans in the House have proposed, and that Trump in his first term proposed to block grant and cut Medicaid. Rural hospitals would disproportionately bear the brunt of that. And as I say, look, there is a lot of ideological sympathy for kind of Trump's view of the world, the idea that coastal elites are kind of getting fat and looking down on you and being favored, and cultural and demographic change is kind of marginalizing these smaller rural, you know, predominantly white in most cases, communities. So there's a lot of ideological affinity for Trump and Trumpism, but to a greater extent than his first term, I think, if he can implement the agenda he ran on, that ideological sympathy will collide with real threats to the material interests of these rural communities. And if he can implement the agenda that he ran on, I think it will test whether anything can loosen or reverse the trend of these smaller places toward the GOP in the Trump era, which has been very powerful the last 10 years.